Et bienvenue à la 31e réunion du Comité permanent des affaires autochtones.
Hello and welcome to the 31st meeting.
The unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. Aujourd'hui, on conclura notre 4e étude sur la
Today we will conclude our fourth study on sovereignty, security, and preparation to emergency for Indigenous peoples in the Arctic.
We will hear from Mika Atagutak, who is an elder, who is here as an individual. We will hear from Merrill Harris, who is a reeve in the municipal district of Taber, Alberta. And we will hear from Mr. Kurt Eby, Director, Regulatory Affairs and Government Relations for the Pelmorex Corporation. Each of our witnesses will have 5 minutes for opening remarks, and then we will go to questions. To ensure the orderly flow of this meeting, I would like to outline a few rules to follow. Members or witnesses may speak in the official language of their choice. Interpretation services in English, French, and Inuktitut are available. Please be patient with the interpretation. There may be a delay, especially since Inuktitut has to be translated first into English and then into French and vice versa. The interpretation button is found at the bottom of your screen, and you can listen in either English or French. If interpretation is lost, let us know, and we'll try to fix the problem before we carry on. Before speaking, please wait till I recognize you by name. When speaking, please speak slowly and clearly. When you are not speaking, your microphone should be on mute. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. So with that, before we go to questions, we will have witness opening statements. And I would now like to invite Elder Atagutak to start us off for 5 minutes.
My name is Mika Atagutak from Pond Inlet. In 2010, our house was collided by, run over by a water truck. Ever since, the house is damaged and started a flood ever since. Last year, we tried to have it repaired, but even us, we started having health problems with skin conditions, and we had to constantly go to health center. So it was deteriorating. The house was deteriorating, and the metal turned black. And we try to keep it clean, but we haven't been successful. We got help from HTMC Housing Corporation, but they are very slow in repairing anything, and nothing has been done to the building ever since. The hamlet of Pond Inlet had investigated the building by staff, and we had to move out of our house. We moved to government housing for 8 months occupation there. It has been a difficult year, and things were slow in a year, so we stayed there for a year at the government housing. Right now they weren't working on the pipes, and the bottom part of the building is deteriorating, and also the wood bottom base, the foundation is very soft where the toilet area is in the bathroom. So the Housing Corporation is looking into this at its time, but it would be very encouraging if you can push and decide when these type of things happened for us who are living in the north. We have many children and grandchildren in my home, and it's an emergency that in the past month this has been an emergency case. I haven't gotten a response about my urgency requests. Please, the people who are living in the north should really be taken a priority and into consideration of this type of things. It's not acceptable to be living in that condition. There are molds pretty much every house up there. Because of that, the Housing Corporation should be encouraged to help the communities. And I am now widowed, and I have nobody to help me. It's been a struggle when nobody is really taking care of us. So since then, that happened, since the collision, it's been slow process, but today the bottom of the building is all flooded again. So I don't know how long we're going to wait to have that repaired. So this, I encourage that you help us, the people who own our own homes in the north. Anything else? This owning our own home. Sometimes the paint wears off around the house, and we cannot do our own painting. So especially the emergency cases should be handled promptly, and we don't have any insurance to cover the repair. We have a cardboard that we use. I put the cardboard around where the molding parts of the building is, and that's how we are in our home. There is rusting metal pipes and hard to keep clean. And we just cover it up with cardboards. Those of us who own our own home, we are neglected by the Housing Corporation. So we get sick, and those are the emergency cases. We try hard to keep it clean, but sometimes they need to be replaced, but once you replace it, it deteriorates again easily.
Thank you very much, Elder.
Thank
you for coming all the way from Pond Inlet to give your testimony today. We will now go to our second speaker, Merrill Harris, Reeve of the Municipal District of Tabor. Mr. Reeve, you have 5 minutes. I beg your pardon. Mr. Harris, you have 5 minutes. Mute. Sorry. Go ahead. We'll start over. You're still showing mute. There we go.
Okay. Now can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you, Honorable Chairman and members of the committee. As we begin today, I'd just like to acknowledge that the land that the MD of Tabor is on and the lands that the projects I'm going to describe today is Treaty 7 lands, and I acknowledge those whose ancestors walked and lived on this land. And we also like to acknowledge that as part of the process from the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, we've had to have consultations with numerous Indigenous groups regarding the horsefly emergency spillway, which I'm going to try and describe here today. I believe your discussion today is around emergency preparedness, and I want to thank my own MP member, Mr. Martin Shields, for the Bow River riding, who's invited me to explain what the Southern Regional Stormwater Drainage Committee is doing to prepare for emergencies. In 2010, Southern Alberta experienced a 1 in 100 year rain event in both the eastern and the western portions of the province. And in 2011, while the rainfall amounts were less than what we experienced in 2010, there was significant flooding in many hectares or acres of land. These events led to the discussion between the Reeve of the Municipal District and chairman of the St. Mary River Irrigation District on how the main canal of the irrigation district could be used as a conduit to move this excess water off of farmland and to minimize the effects of flooding. As you might know, an irrigation district is designed to deliver water to farmland and not a means to accept floodwaters. Irrigation canals get smaller as they move east as they deliver water to farms along the way. Drainage canals need to get bigger as they move east to accept more drainage water. A quick example of the size and amount of water that's carried in this canal is where the canal leaves the Chin Reservoir southwest of Taber. It has a capacity of about 110 cubic meters per second, or roughly 29,000 gallons of water per second. When the canal reaches west of Medicine Hat, Alberta, its capacity has been reduced to about 8.5 cubic meters per second, or about 2,000 gallons per second. So the canal significantly decreases in size over that 250 kilometer stretch of main canal. The Municipal District of Taber spearheaded the drainage project and brought onside the counties of Lethbridge, Warner, Cardston, 40 Mile, and Cypress County, as well as the towns of Taber, Coaldale, and Bow Island, the City of Medicine Hat, the St. Mary River Irrigation and Taber Irrigation Districts, Alberta Environment and Parks, Alberta Transportation, and Alberta Agriculture, and this has been the makeup of our committee since 2013. The committee was able to secure funding to do a regional drainage study for the area, which encompasses over 2 million acres of land. Over 500,000 acres of that land in the study area is very high value irrigated land, producing diverse crops such as potatoes, sugar beets, seed canola, alfalfa, timothy hay, vegetables, and numerous other specialty crops that are the economic engine of southern Alberta. The study was completed in 2014 and identified 7 projects that would help reduce the flooding risks in the area. The total cost for all the projects in 2014 dollars was just about $152 million. And with inflation, et cetera, the estimated cost for all 7 projects now is about $169 million. The Horsefly Emergency Spillway was identified as a top project to start with, as at this point, which is about 10 miles southeast of the town of Taber, that the St. Mary River Irrigation District main canal is closest to the Old Man River, somewhere that the excess drainage water can be returned to a natural river basin. Also at this point on the main canal is the first downsizing of the canal since it leaves the Stafford Reservoir south of Chin, Alberta. The capacity at this point is 110 cubic meters per second, and the plan is to divert about 47 cubic meters per second out of the main canal and into the diversion or spillway. This will leave the main canal able to pick up more drainage water as the canal continues eastward. In reality, this project has 2 purposes. First, to drain flooded waters off private land using the SMRID main canal as the delivery method, and 2, to protect the St. Mary River Irrigation District main canal from a breach or a washout by diverting the excess water back to the river. This main canal is the lifeblood of southern Alberta irrigated agriculture. The economic devastation that would happen if the canal's ability to deliver water was lost for a growing season or even part of a growing season. Again, the 2 purposes of the project is to drain floodwater off the land, and 2, to protect the main canal's ability to deliver irrigation water in an efficient and timely manner. In the spring of 2018, we had another flooding event. Lots of snow over the winter and a quick melt. We almost lost the main canal, or it was almost breached by the volume of floodwaters entering that main canal. It was the worst overland flooding that the MD of Taber had ever experienced. We were in a state of local emergency for 50 days due to the flooding. Phase 1 of this project has now been put out for tenders, and that closes on October 13th of this year. And we hope to get construction started yet this year. Phases 2 and 3 of the project are in the engineering design stages, and we hope to get those tendered and constructed starting next year. And I'm sure that I'm over my 5 minutes already, so I would take questions anywhere along the line.
Thank you, Mr. Harris. We'll now go to Mr. Eby. Mr. Eby from the Pelmorex Corporation. Sir, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As introduced, I'm Kurt Eby. I work at the Pelmorex Corporation. I think most of you would better know us by our popular brand names, the Weather Network and Messio Media in Quebec. These are our primary businesses. What I'm here to talk about is another thing that we lead and do for the country is in 2010, as a condition of our broadcasting license, we built what we call the National Alert Aggregation and Dissemination System, or the NAD system, which is the technical component of the National Public Alerting System. Originally, it processed alerts that were distributed on TV and radio. So we're talking about amber alerts, tornado, severe thunderstorm, flooding, forest fire. I'm sure everyone is probably familiar with it now, especially because in 2018, we launched the wireless alerting component of that system, and that's made it a lot more in people's hands and in people's homes. We're effectively the technical vendor of the alerting system. We have two roles. One is the technology. We take direction from authorized government agencies, basically all the emergency management organizations from the provinces, as well as Environment, Climate Change Canada, Public Safety Canada, on technical upgrades to the system. We also are the system administrator, which means we have agreements and manage the accounts of every province and territory and Environment and Climate Change Canada right now. And that's what we're here to talk about. We manage those accounts based on who has the jurisdiction to issue an emergency alert. So Environment Canada issues tornado alerts anywhere in the country. Most public safety jurisdiction falls to the provinces, which is why we have, and the territories, which is why we have accounts with contracts and accounts with the provinces and territories. And then within those jurisdictions, they decide who can and cannot issue alerts and for what. So you have kind of a mix of the way that's administrated. Saskatchewan has many issuers. Ontario, for instance, the OPP issues amber alerts and active shooter type dangerous person alerts on behalf of other police agencies. And then everything else is through the provincial EMO. This varies from province to province based on a number of reasons. But we can't, on a jurisdictional basis, we can't go and give an account to a police agency because, if you were an emergency management organization for a province and all of a sudden a police agency started issuing alerts and you didn't know, obviously we would be jumping over that jurisdiction. What we are here to discuss today is something that we have been discussing internally and with some of our colleagues and those we work with is the concept of is Pelmorex taking on administration of accounts for First Nations where they want it and where we would get direction from the federal or provincial governments or some combination of the two. This is kind of where we're uncertain. We understand First Nations do have an amount of sole jurisdiction. First Nations Indigenous Affairs largely falls under the federal government. Right now, public safety on First Nations largely falls under the provincial government. So it's just something we wanted to start talking about and see how we could do that. So we would be taking on greater responsibility for administering accounts and helping folks get up and running on the system where that would happen. The alert system is very customizable, so any given issuer can have permissions set for them. So it could be that they could only issue alerts for, say, forest fires and floods, and police agencies would handle other types of alerts, things like that. So there is a lot of customization available, and definitely one thing to always keep in mind is there is no one-size-fits-all solution in any account across the country. We see a variety of approaches used, and we help to facilitate that. And it's just something I'm really looking forward to speaking with the committee members about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Eby. We'll now go to the questions. First round, starting with the Conservatives. Mr. Shields, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, and appreciate all the witnesses being here today. And I think that final comment made by Mr. Eby, not one size fits all, is what we're really hearing in the variety of witnesses we have here today when we're talking about emergency management and communication. So it's great to have you witness here. As the Reeve Harris mentioned, in his area just to the north of him in 2013, the flooding that happened people remember the flood in Calgary, but what they obviously don't know and remember is the flood water goes past Calgary and affected Siksika Nation, huge, and the Eastern Irrigation District, which they got together afterwards because they built an emergency dam to take care of flood water in that area, and that has now been completed. So, Mr. Harris, you're an ag producer, right?
Yes, that's correct, Martin.
So you understand this in a sense from a producer as well as a person in a sense of municipal government. Now, as you organized, and I know you were involved in the emergency management, so there's two pieces to my question. One, in the sense of how did emergency management work and how did it resolve the issue at the time? And then once you built the plan, working with the other groups that weren't directly on the land, but as Kainai is to the west of the Blackfoot Confederacy, there was consultation that followed up with them as well. So could you do the two parts?
Yeah, as a result of the flooding in 2010 and 2011, like I said, we brought together, and I wasn't on our council at that point in time, but the council brought together the municipal district of Taber, counties of Lethbridge, Warner, 40 Mile, Cypress, and because we all were affected one way or the other by this overland flooding, and like I said, our committee has worked tirelessly in the past 8 or 9, 10 years to get this project off the ground, and we're finally there. As far as like I said, the Indigenous part of it, we have consulted with numerous First Nations to get their approval and their blessing on doing this project, and they've been, they've given their blessing to it. They, are interested in being part of the construction part of it if that's possible, probably in the sub trades, and we have been keeping them in mind throughout this whole process.
So the process that you're referring to, in a sense, is returning the water to its natural water course, which is the Oman River. Now, one of the things that people may not understand, but and you probably do, is living in that area, returning water or flood waters being in a river basin actually keeps the river environment healthier. From your experience, is that something that you could relate to from what you know?
Yeah, the St. Mary River main canal kind of acts as a dam, through the southern Alberta. It blocks somewhat of the natural flows of water back to its to the river basin, and so it's by doing this project, we're returning in flood years. We're returning water back to the natural river basin that is held up as a result of the Old Man Dam or the St. Mary River main canal as it goes across the land. It kind of impedes the natural drainage flows, and most farmers don't like their land being flooded, especially when there's a crop on it. So the idea is to get that water off of land and fields as quickly as possible, and this emergency spillway helps get the water back into the natural, where the water would naturally flow quicker.
So one of the things, in a sense, you mentioned a little bit about agriculture. From my understanding, 4% of the land in Alberta produces upwards of 20% of the agriculture GDP. So this is a critical aspect when we're talking about food security in this country. This is a critical project.
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's lots of potatoes grown in this area, sugar beets, seed canola, timothy, all those kind of high-valued crops. And a potato crop, for example, it doesn't take long, or a sugar beet crop, when it's underwater for very long, it dies, or it becomes unmarketable. I know as we were doing harvest the other day and potatoes in pivot track ruts, when the potatoes are kind of on the side of those pivot track ruts, they're often very soft and gooey, and one of the jobs of the graders is to pull those kind of potatoes out of the line because they're unmarketable. And so if your whole field is underwater, your potato crop becomes unmarketable pretty quick when it's underwater like that.
And as the only area left in Canada that's actually growing sugar beets and a sugar factory, this is the only place left that sugar can actually be refined.
That's correct. The Taber area has the only beet sugar refining plant left in all of Canada. The other growing areas have all shut down over the years, and we produce between 8 and 10% of the Canadian sugar market demands, and most of it is marketed here in Western Canada. Some of it gets down into the US in TRQs, but most of it is here for the market in Western Canada, and it's the only place left that in Canada that produces domestically grown sugar.
Thank you for explaining your emergency management. Really appreciate that. Thank you, Reeve.
You betcha. Thank you, MP Shields.
Thank you, Mr. Shields. We'll go to Ms. Atwin for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses today and to our committee members for joining. I've got a few kind of questions that might be a little all over the place, so I'm trying to direct them to each of you individually. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Eby. You mentioned that there's customization options for these kinds of alerts, and I'm wondering, has there been a request at all to have Indigenous languages incorporated to ensure that everyone is able to access these alerts? Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I can't remember a request for it. The NAD system supports 4 Indigenous languages. It has since it was built in 2010: Cree, Dene, Inuktitut, and Inuktitut. I believe it's only been used. The Inuktitut feature's been used for some of the test alerts in Nunavut, but the others have not been used in a live alert.
Okay, thank you very much. And for Mr. Harris, you mentioned consultations when you're preparing and kind of developing and rolling out projects, consultations with Indigenous communities. And I'm just wondering if you could give us a little bit more of an explanation about what that looks like, and if you had advice for other municipalities on how to have a successful engagement to include Indigenous voices.
Okay, like I said earlier, the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, which we have to work with, required we consulted with the following Treaty 6 nations: the Samson Cree Nation, the Lewis Bowl Nation, the Montana First Nation, Ermineskin Cree First Nation, Treaty 7, the Stoney Nakoda Nations, the Tsuut'ina, the Siksika, and the Piikani Nations, as well as the Foothills Ojibwe First Nation and the Métis Nation of Alberta. And they were all given the opportunity, they were all given the information of what we were doing and invited to come down here, and 3 of them actually visited the site and gave their blessing to what was happening here. And like I said, some of the ones that were here that provided letters of response indicated they'd be interested in participating on the construction side of things if that was ever possible. And so once the awards are tendered or is awarded, they'll be notified of who got the general contract, and then they can see if they can work with the general contractor in providing labor and skills and resources in the construction process.
Excellent, thank you. And are you seeing the same level of preparation in neighboring municipalities? And how can the Government of Canada best support you in these efforts?
Like I said, there was 7 projects that were identified in the overall drainage study that was done, and they span across the the region from Lethbridge all the way to Medicine Hat. This project is the one that's closest, like I said, to a natural river course, which is the Old Man River. But there are other projects. 3 of them I can see in front of me are actually in Cypress County, closer to Medicine Hat. One of those projects is already being done by the St. Mary's River Irrigation District, and one of the other projects that's closer to Taber is being done by the St. Mary River Irrigation District. So that's 3 of the 7 projects are underway now. And what I found is that whenever we met with our members of Parliament, and that would be Member Shields and Member Glenn Motts from the Medicine Hat Cardston riding, they very strongly encouraged us to work collaboratively, regionally. It carries more weight when you can work together, and we do have a very good working relationship with all of our partners in getting this project done.
Excellent, thank you. And my last question to Madame Atagudak, Kainamik, for being here with us today. I really would just like to tap into your knowledge. In your experience, what are the kind of climate change impacts that you're seeing in your community, and how can the Government of Canada better support more resilient communities in the North? And this can include, again, we're talking about the different housing needs, some of the materials being used perhaps. So just if you could kind of generally what you're seeing on the ground in your community.
This climate change definitely had changed especially the animal harvesting seasons, and the foundations are deteriorating, and the foundations of the buildings, because of the ground is deteriorating, is rotting. There should be emergency, or you shouldn't be abandoned, should be dealt with right away, should be emergency preparedness for those. So any one of the foundations, the buildings are damaged by the climate change. And because the permafrost melted towards the community, so the foundations have deteriorated from the climate change.
Thank you very much. That's all, Mr.
Thank you, Ms. Atwin. Et nous irons maintenant à Madame Gill pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. J'aimerais poser une question tout d'abord.
I have a question to Mr. Eby concerning these alerts. I was wondering, it was clear that it is very difficult to act with several players and that we could improve the way we go about it. So my first question, what is different in Indigenous communities and in Northern communities? They do not have access to the same service, to the same infrastructure as other communities. And according to you, how could we collaborate better? And what changes have to be brought about to improve the situation? Thank you, Mr. Eby.
It's not really an issue of what's different. What I was trying to say is there's different approaches across the country. Saskatchewan and Alberta, for instance, are the only provinces that give access to municipalities to issue alerts. It's really more tightly controlled and centralized in most places, and so this is not necessarily an issue about First Nations versus non-First Nations. It's about from our standpoint, we kind of saw this. The jurisdiction was not as clear for us, and we thought this was an opportunity to get some more communities and First Nations communities, especially that might be a little more vulnerable, in particular to flooding and forest fires, and would want the autonomy to use the system in some instances. And we wanted to facilitate that. What we need is direction. Either from the provinces or from the government to kind of help move this along.
Fait ma question, Monsieur Eby.
Mr. Eby, I didn't want to oppose one group to another, but my question was more technical. You say, yes, we are working with communities, and communities can emit themselves an alert. So is there a difference? What is more difficult for communities who do not have the same resources as others?
Emergency alert, you need an internet connection. We provide an interface that a duty officer or someone would log into. You type in, where is it going to go? What's the message look like? and that's really it. I mean, obviously, there's an issue of to receive an alert, you have to have an LTE connection on your phone, which, if we're talking about some First Nations would be more remote, and I hear don't have as good of cell phone coverage.
Exactement. Merci beaucoup.
Indeed. Thank you so much, because that's what I wanted to validate with you and show this, because this is exactly what's happening at home. We do not have enough coverage, telephone coverage, and if there is a storm like Fiona, people didn't have these basic services, so it was very difficult to communicate. So I thank you so much. Do I have some time left, Mr. Chair? Because I have a question. I have a question for Mrs. Takutak. What are the needs currently? What are the community needs? I would like to hear, is it more and more important because there are more accidents, quote unquote, climatic events? She's here as an individual. What does she feel about the support that is given to her community, and what is the difference between this kind of support and does all her community receive the necessary support? Thank you.
The emergency preparedness. For example, today my house is unlivable, and I would like the housing corporations be encouraged to help. And there's lack of service.
Igluma ilaksanga mumiartua korea qalerpaqluni auyanngorsiilerng milunga tamanna pitaqakkanneria qallattaartuugalua tappaani nunattini nunali mikittiutaunersani isimagijauqqanneerunnaqullugu iglunu nangmineriojunu nalliukkumaaksani suurlu iglu ilaksangin
are neglected by the housing corporation. We have to get our parts from sea lift, and it would be wise to encourage the housing corporations. Especially most neglected are the people who own their own homes. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Gill. Nous irons maintenant à Madame pour 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. Gill. Now, Mrs. Elout, 6 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, thank you very much for the witness who are present here today. Your comments are very important. I just want to ask Mika Atagutak. I want you to clarify with you what you're talking about here today as a witness. I asked you, us, the parliamentarians here, or the committees here, if we have to repair our homes, they would need help with go to the local hardware store and buy their products. It's not the case for us. Perhaps you can explain that a bit more. Everything is more out of reach. I can say when I own my own home, I have to wait for my housing supplies. After we had moved to another home because it's unlivable. By the time the ship arrives, the house foundation had already deteriorated, so for the supplies that we ordered are not feasible. So everything is very slow process, and we have to wait for a very long time for certain things to be repaired. And we have absolutely nothing locally. And even they cannot be shipped by airplanes. Thank you. Thank you. You had briefly stated about the insurance. Can you clarify more about the insurance, how hard it is to get insurance, how hard it is to claim an insurance? So, for example, with your home insurance, can you clarify that more? Yes, we have insurance for our house, of course, but we can get our supplies upon our request. But when they look over our insurances, they don't apply in our insurance what we actually need for the homes. So the insurance are completely unusable, are invalid for the specific needs that we need in the north. So therefore, the Housing Corporation should be informed of what kind of insurance would be covered under them. My last question to you. You said earlier that the Housing Corporation need to assist. Can you clarify that a bit more? The CMHC, how we can recommend, or how do you think we should recommend? My house needs a lot of repair, and we have to wait for a very long time for the supplies, although it's an emergency case. So, and they don't even answer to us for a very long time. So they just promise us they would do something about it, and they don't. So I wish they would be encouraged more that we are in need of emergency getting our buildings repaired. It would be very useful if they can have everything ready for us when we have our emergency situation.
A shortened second round. It would be 3 minutes for Conservatives and Liberals and 1.5 minutes for the Bloc and for NDP. If you wish to avail yourself of that. I see Mr. Vidal is interested, so Mr. Vidal, why don't you kick it off for 3 minutes?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to thank all of the witnesses for taking time to be here with us today. And with my limited time, I am going to focus on just one question then for Mr. Eby. And sir, you talked about the NAD system, the alerts, authorizations, et cetera, and as a former mayor, I kind of have been through that process of having to go through the authorizations of who could issue those alerts for our little city in northern Saskatchewan. But you went on to talk about accounts for First Nations communities. And in my riding, which encompasses the north half of Saskatchewan, there's very many unique circumstances of remoteness, of rural and remote communities, including First Nations communities. My colleague, Mr. Shields, talked about one size not fitting all. So in the context of pursuing this idea of the individual First Nations being able to be part of the system, would one of the benefits be it could be more localized, very specific content to their community, or on a more general sense, maybe what would be the benefits and the barriers that you would see of advancing your system into the localized efforts of each First Nation?
Thank you for the question. Good question. And to clarify, Alberta does have some First Nations that do have access to use it, but as far as I understand, no other province does. The benefits is just to have the local emergency management organizations on the ground issuing the alerts, and having that autonomy to do so. Another benefit that I could see is right now we do see the system is used on kind of an inconsistent basis, and so you could have there's never been a forest fire alert issued in Ontario. There's obviously been forest fires, and so enabling more users, would lead ideally to more use of the system. We built the system to be used to save lives, and that's a major benefit, whether it's to First Nations or to any community. But a remote community might benefit more, and they know what's going on there, and it might be more of a challenge to have an alert issued through a centralized agency, although that wouldn't always be the case, but that could be the case.
A little bit,
You still have 35 seconds if you want.
Thank you. I never started my clock this time, Mr. Chair. Just a quick follow-up then, and a couple of my colleagues already mentioned it, but that remoteness and the connectivity and the availability of Wi-Fi, I assume that's going to be one of the huge barriers to achieving that on a localized level. Is that correct?
I could only speculate from what I hear about the level of connectivity in certain areas, but the alert system does also issue alerts over radio and TV, so it's a three-prong approach. So that helps. Obviously, if your radio's on or your TV's on, you'll still get alerts, but you need an LTE connection to receive them. So that helps to cover more of the bases, regardless of the situation.
Thank you, Mr. Vidal. I believe it's Mr. Weiler for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd also like to thank the witnesses for joining for our important study today. I do want to direct my questions in my limited time to Mr. Eby. First, I just want to confirm that the system that you administer, I'm a BC MP, is one and the same as the Alert Ready system.
Correct. I did mention that the brand name of the system is Alert Ready. Yes.
Great. Well, one of the topics that was brought up here is just the challenge of having a lack of cell phone reception in many remote communities, especially Indigenous communities across the country. And I'm curious, in communities where you don't have this cell phone reception, have there been policies and programs put in place where the alert is shared with an area that does have those connections, that it could be rebroadcasted in other means where individuals may or may not have that cell phone reception?
Nothing like that. Like I said, it's on TV, on radio. There are a number of apps that take those alerts. The Weather Network app rebroadcasts alerts on a local area, so you'd have to be connected to Wi-Fi and not LTE. So it's a multi-pronged approach. But right now, it's TV, radio, wireless, and then some apps do rebroadcast the alerts also.
Thank you very much. And I'm curious, in the province of British Columbia, you mentioned that Alberta had allowed some First Nations to be able to be on the system. Have you had any conversations with Indigenous nations in BC for having that same type of ability, or rather with the province for allowing that to take place?
We have not yet. It's something we want to pursue, but we started at the federal level. We've had some conversations with Public Safety Canada informally, just to say this is something we would take on and facilitate. If the challenge was having a different agency to administer the accounts. If that's not the challenge, the provinces could do it. And I think you would also find there's probably many First Nations that like the current situation where it's issued on a provincial basis, but we're trying to put it out there as something to move forward and help how we can.
Absolutely. Well, as a MP in BC, I'm concerned about the operation of the app here, because in fact it wasn't even used at all until 2022. And there was considerable controversy last year when we had the heat dome, the wildfires, and the atmospheric river, and there was no notification sent at all to people. I know, in fact, people that were caught in a landslide driving on an unsafe road that was destabilized because of the atmospheric rivers. So I would hope that would change. But in BC, what are the different weather events that can be circulated as a risk on the app.
And to clarify, it's not an app; it's a cell broadcast system. But for weather events right now, Environment Canada issues alerts for tornadoes and now severe thunderstorms. Other weather events, and I had this conversation with other colleagues of yours in British Columbia, with flooding. Flooding is typically, even though it's caused by a weather event, what the alerts are primarily coming for is the anticipated damage or road closures, evacuation orders. Those would come from the provincial EMO, and they would. I understand this situation in BC now as they've asked the regional municipalities to request the alerts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weiler. Madame Gill, si vous le désirez, vous avez une.
Mrs. Gill, you have a minute and a half if you'd like. Thank you very much to the witnesses, but I don't have any further questions. Thank you. Mrs. Idlout.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mika Atagutak what you talked about, that you own your own home and you have not been able to live in your own home. How did that touch you personally and to your family? And you felt you were homeless. And can you tell us a little bit more about your personal experience as when you wouldn't be able to live in your own home? I can say for 8 months I was homeless, and my home was absolutely damaged, and it was molded everywhere. It was really hard to repair, and we waited for a very long time for the supplies. The government housing we were at, and we had to take good care of it. And if we break something in it, we would have to pay for it. And we have to be extra cautious. I have many grandchildren, and they're small, so they just want to destroy this and that. It was challenging to try to look after this unit we were at, owned by the government. So managed to keep it pretty clean and undamaged while we wait, but while they're working on the foundation and the floor. And we had to move there before it was completed because our term with the government housing had ended. So we moved to an unfinished house. Can you make a resolution to the federal government? How would you write if you were to make a recommendation? I would say those of us who own our own home, we cannot get to Inuit or to CMHC housing at all, and we tried to get into their units, was not allowed to. And finally, the hamlet of Pond Inlet gave us the government housing as an emergency shelter. So I like to see that people who own their own homes, that if there's an emergency case in their homes, be able to occupy at CMHC's buildings.
I would like to thank Mika Atagutak, Mr. Merrill Harris, and Mr. Kurt Eby for coming this morning, for giving us your opening remarks, and for answering all of our questions on this very important topic. So thank you again. With that, we will now suspend for a few minutes as we transition to the second panel. Thank you. Second panel. Our second panel will consist of Chief Dwayne Thomas and Chief Sarah Sunday Diabo from the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne, who are here in person today. Chief April Martel from the Katlodici First Nation, if she manages to join us. She is not on yet. And Mr. Lucas King, Director, Territorial Planning Unit of the Grand Council Treaty Number 3. Just a reminder for the new panel witnesses, let me repeat that there is English, French, and Inuktitut interpretation if you choose to have it. Select the language on the button that's called interpretation, and it looks like a globe at the bottom of your screen. And you can listen to the proceedings in either English or French. There will, however, be questions in English, French, and Inuktitut asked by the members of the committee. With that said, before we go to the question period, let me invite Chief Dwayne Thomas and Chief Sarah Diabo to take the microphone for a combination of 5 minutes. Thank you.
Sego. My name is Chief Sarah Sunday Diabo. I represent the Gisnaina district of the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne. This is my first year on council, and my previous role was I was the emergency manager for the St. Regis Mohawk tribe with Akwesasne, our counterpart on the southern portion of Akwesasne. As you may know, Akwesasne is a multi-jurisdiction community. We have two United States, the international border runs right straight through our community. So we have to deal with the American side as well as the Canadian side, two provinces, two counties, St. Lawrence County and Franklin County on the New York State side, and Quebec and Ontario provinces. My role was to I assisted with, I didn't see a border in my community, so whenever we would have any planning activities, we did an Akwesasne Joint Emergency Operations Plan that consisted of all our hazards. So I would do mitigation plans, I would do continuity of operation plans, I would do some pandemic plans for my community, and I always would have external as well as internal stakeholders. So our stakeholder consisted about 50 federal partners such as the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, as well as New York State Office of Emergency Measures, as well as Emergency Measures of Ontario through Canada. And Quebec, because of the language difference, we didn't really participate with them because we don't speak French, so it was hard to work with them. We do have two police departments, the St. Regis Mohawk Tribal Police, as well as the Akwesasne Mohawk Police. We have one fire department, and each fire department has a substation in Ontario, Akwesasne, Ontario, Akwesasne, Quebec, as well as the main headquarters is in New York State. So we're one fire department that serves two countries and two provinces. They're all volunteer. I think we have a fire department of probably about 240 active members. And so they do anything from hazmat response to ice rescue. They have a marine unit. They're very active in the community, as well as sometimes they're often employees of Mohawk Council. And we do have one ambulance unit that's New York State certified, housed in Quebec, that responds to New York State, Ontario, and Quebec. They're all New York State certified. We have 3 paramedics, some advanced life support, EMTs, basic EMTs, and drivers. So, as well as we have environment crew that does hazmat response for our, we have multiple incidents of the ships running aground through our St. Lawrence River. So we have to go and respond because it would affect our water treatment facilities. So we learned how to do boom deployment. We learned how to do cleanup. We've learned how to take care of our waters, because in our belief, in our culture, it's really, our water is sacred. So we all have to protect that because of the water intakes and things like that. And oftentimes we do all this training with the U.S. Coast Guard as well as Canadian Coast Guard. So we have a good relationship with both United States and Canada's Coast Guard, where they would come in and train with us, and we do a lot of mutual aid with them, as well as the U.S. Canadian Customs and the Canadian Border Protection. We would have various tabletop exercises and various mock drills, and whatever we would need, they were a support to us. So we would have this local emergency planning committee of all these different agencies and that would come onto our territory and just train with us and give us guidance and give us share their resources with us. We do have our own health department on both sides. In Akwesasne, everything has to be duplicated because we have probably about 14,000 members that they're enrolled on both sides. So some live on the U.S. portion of Akwesasne and some live on the Canadian portion. So we have to have a New York State Department of Health as well as our own health department. We have 2 long-term care facilities, one in Ontario and one in Quebec of Akwesasne. We have daycare centers, we have recreation facilities, and our own school system. We have an Akwesasne Board of Education that are on our territory up to grade 8. And sometimes this is, one is Mohawk Emerge, where we teach the Mohawk language, the culture, the ceremonies to our youth and try to bring back the language and make them fluent speakers. And we have our own bus-in that transport these kids, and on a daily basis, they have to go through United States, go through report to customs, go back in through and go into Quebec portion of Akwesasne. So that's probably about a 40-minute round trip for these children. As well as on the way home, they got to go through Canadian customs as well.
That's the 5 minutes is up,
Okay.
but we'll have questions for you,
right.
Chief Diabo. So thank you. Thank you. And I'd now like to go to Mr. Lucas King, Director, Territorial Planning Unit, Grand Council Treaty Number 3, for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. My name is Lucas King, and I'm the Director of the Territorial Planning Unit at Grand Council Treaty 3. I certainly appreciate the invitation to be here today to work together with the federal government and on the critical issue that is water regulation, and from that, emergency management in Treaty 3. I'd like to thank the committee members and other participants for having me and Grand Council represented. So several weeks ago, we were asked by one of our local MPs to share experience and knowledge on water in Treaty 3. And to say the least, in Treaty 3 over the past 2 years has been extreme. Last year, the territory experienced one of the lowest water levels on record. This resulted in, I'm sure, well-known drought and fire emergencies across the territory. I would have liked to kind of share some photos, but just through time constraints and translation, we couldn't get that in front of you this morning. However, one of the photos we had just showcased the about 10-foot difference in between the water levels this past year and the year before. Climate change is really creating increasingly unpredictable water levels, making it very difficult for emergency management planning and damage mitigation in Treaty 3. In contrast to the year before this past year, we had large amount of snowfall and rain throughout the season. We then got this spring a lot of flooding, damaging land, water treatment plants, docks, bridges, homes, and left communities in Treaty 3 with impeded access to food, medical appointments, and work. Evacuations and loss of the sacred sites from flooding also impacted Treaty 3 communities and directly impacted their inherent and treaty rights. Through all of this lingering impacts of the global pandemic, all of it weighed incredibly heavy. compounding the struggles people faced, the ability to evacuate, be with family, and be in safe spaces through everything going on. The second photo I would have liked to share was around harmonizing governance structures. And, October 3rd is a special day in Treaty 3, and today marks specifically 149 years since the signing of Treaty 3, 2023 coming up on 150 years, and a year to celebrate that special relationship and sacred relationship. So it's really our responsibility as treaty partners to work together in relation to shared lands in Canada, because that's the essence of that treaty land, right? Is that responsibility to harmonize our governance and work together as brothers in that shared capacity. So modeling provides a great tool for understanding a basin when we talk about water regulation and water quantity. However, though we've seen in the last 2 years, especially with the impacts of climate change, our understanding certainly needs to be more holistic, and our decision-making structures need to reflect that. So it's really only through harmonization of governance and decision-making protocols that we'll be able to better manage our own responsibilities and relationship to water in Treaty 3. And that doesn't mean manage water. It means, manage ourselves and understand those protocols between both governments of what that looks like in water in Treaty 3. We at Grand Council are always going to be willing to cooperate with any level of government to any treaty partner because of that sacred relationship, willing to share our knowledge and experience and expertise to find solutions to the issues that we face together. Because today, as we see it, right, as we move forward, we need to harmonize those governance structures, because from the last 2 years, it's been Treaty 3 communities that have been the most affected by these water regulation impacts. And it's also the communities that have the least amount of say in terms of this water regulation and protocols. And it's all within that Western structure. So we really do need to take a hard look at how we manage ourselves, what our principles of decision-making are, and what our governance structures are moving forward. So we can take that more holistic look. Just as we found out through the global pandemic, it's something that, we could only work together on as a whole. And climate change and water regulation is something of the same, as it doesn't just sit in one jurisdiction, it connects everyone. So with that, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today, share our experiences from Grand Council with you, and look forward to the rest of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King. Unfortunately, our third witness, Chief Martel, is not yet with us, so we're going to proceed with questions, beginning with the Conservatives. And I have Mr. Vidal for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for taking the time to be here with us today. We were chatting briefly about the fact that fall is in the air, and we're probably not going to avoid that as it transitions to winter, right? But I want to thank you for coming and sharing your knowledge with us. I have a couple questions for Chief Thomas and Chief Diabo first. The comments you made were actually quite amazing in the context of you managing multi-jurisdictional challenges. I, as a former mayor and whatever, and just dealing with different levels of government, I appreciated your perspective, a very positive perspective, and I'm sure it has its challenges. But emergency management is a shared responsibility, obviously, and you're sharing it with way more than most people have to. We heard testimony in the last hour from the people that issue the alerts, the alerting system, and they talked about wanting to engage individual nations on maybe being part of that at their own level. So I'm trying to flesh this out in the context of you having to deal with what I know I used to have to deal with as a mayor, and you having to deal with multiple jurisdictions. Would it be beneficial for you, or do you already maybe issue your own emergency alerts just for your nation and your communities?
Thank you. We don't have the reverse 911. It's only good for the Ontario portion of Akwesasne. So when I had wanted to start this, it's called Community Emergency Response Teams, almost like a neighborhood watch where you create these neighborhood groups and you do our Akwesasne is kind of one big family. So everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows who's the elder or who lives alone, and create these little teams and have them do door-to-door checks if we need to evacuate or things like that. But we don't have any reverse 911 or alert system just because a lot of our phone numbers are American or Canadian, and you can't do that. So it would just have to be old school way, door to door, knock on the door to see if they're okay and things like that. And with social media involved, that's another way we use, as well as we have our own local radio station, which is our lifeline to Akwesasne. So everybody, in the event of a power outage or evacuation or winter storms, everybody turns on to CKON. And in the past, we have given these kits with, it has 3 to 5 days worth of food, water, a little radio, flashlight, battery. So we would deliver that door to door and give them to our community so they could turn on the radio at least and have some ways to get in touch with the first responders.
I appreciate that very much so, and the effort you make to do that. That makes a lot of sense. And the witness last hour talked about TV, radio. You know, it's not just an alert on your phone. It's a multi-pronged thing. But if you could actually have an alerting system that worked where you could issue very specific local alerts, without having to rely on the going door to door, would that be a benefit to you? And I'm sorry, I'm looking for a pretty quick answer because I want to get on something else if I could before my time runs out.
It would be beneficial for us to do for a cell phone service, like a first response type of capability, yes.
Most people have access to cell coverage, do they? Yeah, okay, that's good.
We do have pockets in our community, though, where we don't have cell service, just because of the geography of our community. And Sarah and I represent the same district, and we live about a quarter mile from one another, and there's times we don't get cell service at our homes. If you see, most of us, this is my chief's phone, which is Canadian, and this is Verizon on the American side, only because I get better service with Verizon where we're located. So we have to,
Sorry, I appreciate that. Where I come from, there's many of my communities in my riding that don't have cell coverage at all, so I can appreciate that very, very, very much. My time is running out. I want to switch gears a little bit and just ask you one further question. And this is maybe a little bit more of a curiosity question than it is. There's a lot of talk in the last few weeks around policing on First Nations, and I mean, this is all driven out of an incident that happened in my northern Saskatchewan area, right? You have your own police force already. I would love to chat with you in more detail someday about that. But in the context of having your own police force, I want you to tie that back specifically to emergent issues where we have emergencies. Could you talk about the benefit of having your own police force when it comes to an emergency situation in your communities?
I'll speak to that. In our community, for the last close to 50 years, we've had on the northern portion, we've had the Akwesasne Mohawk Police, and it's only been in the last couple of years that we let people come in and map our streets, and currently we don't have a 911 system because some of our community members don't feel comfortable giving out their information to the outside world. So with a local community force, and for years it was only people from our community. We were lucky that people were stepping up and filling those roles, but in the last 5 years, we've had a lot of more people from outside of the territory apply because we had no other applicants get in. So if I said, so my house, for example, when I was a dispatcher for the Mohawk Police, I said, go to Dwayne Thomas's house. The guy on the other end said, oh, okay. I didn't have to say 318 Wade LaFrance. So in our community, that knowledge of who we are and where everyone lives and the families and the closeness really helps when you get in that situation and all of a sudden you're in a panic mode and something's happening, there's a house on fire, you know, there's an ice storm of 98, you know, any of those things, and you say, go to, and the person on the other end says, who's that? Which district is that? You know, they want a physical address because that's what they know. Whereas our local community. And like I say, for probably the first 45 years, being all serviced by people from Akwesasne, you could say that and they know where to go and you don't have to. So in that respect, it's a positive thing. The other thing is being in a small community, everybody knows your business. So when somebody's sick or something, our first responders are aware of that. Sarah's husband is EMT, and he has a great memory and he remembers a lot of things. So he knows things someone from the outside might not know. So I think those things are great things. And not only that, for myself, I went to school off the reservation. And so I had a lot of friends in our neighboring town of Messina, New York, because that's where I went to high school. In the early 90s, going up to visit them, to get pulled over and questioned and say, why are you in Messina? And I would always say, is it illegal to be in Messina? You know, I knew what they were getting at because I was coming from the local First Nations community and I was into trouble or something. I don't know why that assumption was, but to get pulled over on your territory and recognize a person and have a friendly face and stuff like that, it definitely helps in our community.
Thank you, Chief. We'll now go, I believe, to Mr. Pulowski for 6 minutes, if I've got that right.
Yep, it's me. And thanks, Chief. That was a very interesting, good response. I'm going to concentrate on Lucas. Lucas, welcome to INAN. I'm glad you're here. The committee won't know it, but on the western part of my riding is all Treaty 3. So during the flooding this spring, I was up there. I certainly saw in Seine River cars floating in the river, the community center, basically an island surrounded by sandbags and water around that. Couchiching, which is in close to Fort Francis, there was a lot of houses flooded as well. But Lucas, maybe you could tell me more about the extent of the damage in the spring and which communities. And as I recall, it was kind of interesting because the communities that were kind of further upriver, like Lac La Croix, had the flooding first, and then as the water levels kind of rose downstream, then you had flooding in other areas. But maybe you could just tell us more about the damage this spring.
Sure, and I think the first thing I'd touch on there is that it wasn't just the spring, and that was the issue in Treaty 3 this year. So normally when we have a flood event, right, we have that, it starts at the headwaters and we have that flood event. And then, you know, by July and August, it is flowed through the system. And there was so much water this year. So if we start in the eastern portion of Treaty 3, Couchiching, Seine River, Lac La Croix, they all experienced housing loss, infrastructure on the water damage, water treatment plants, and all of that then flowed through the Rainy River to Lake of the Woods. And that's where we saw then the Lake of the Woods level rise, impacting our communities on Lake of the Woods to the same extent of access to community centers, education, roads in and out of the communities, evacuations. The sandbagging efforts were out of control, and this stemmed into July and August. It wasn't actually until about 2 weeks ago that water was off a lot of the physical infrastructure on the lake. But that same experience is then still being experienced on the Winnipeg River flowing into the Lake Winnipeg system. So that high water was unprecedented in terms of the longevity within the territory too, because we just tried to keep getting as much out as possible, and there wasn't the infrastructure in place to get enough out or enough sooner. So we had White Dog First Nation, for example, instead of sandbagging, actually dumped a pile of sand in front of their water treatment plant to try and stop water coming in because there just wasn't time. So each community now has had costs associated with rising roadways and other infrastructure up about 6 to 7 feet in some places.
Now, Lucas, you and I have talked about this before. In the Winnipeg River system, there are several dams. There are several natural points that are kind of choke points where the water builds up behind those points, right? And so if you're looking at how to alleviate the problem for example, in Rainy Lake, if you were to make a bigger passage going into Rainy River, then you would create more of a problem potentially in Rainy River. And similarly, out of Lake of the Woods, there's a dam there. But I don't think that's the choke point. It's further downstream. But if you were to kind of open it up there, then you could potentially have more flooding in the Winnipeg River, right? So can you explain some of that?
For sure. And, we've had this conversation around the infrastructure that's currently in the Rainy Lake of the Woods system, right? And, a lot of that has been around for decades now. And so there's natural choke points along the way, right? And that's where we see you can't get enough water through the Rainy River in this situation to bring down Rainy and Namakan lakes, right? And that's how you experience that high water level. And then similarly, as you're going out the Winnipeg River to bring the Lake of the Woods, which is the big storage reservoir, right? And then Lac Seul, and you'll actually see like grave sites being eroded in Lac Seul, and there is physical like bones being shown in shorelines. You can't get enough water out fast enough to then alleviate that pressure. That being said, starting to redo or manipulate those choke points, right? Like that's why we're sitting here now again, right? So is that really the right answer in terms of doing more manipulation to Mother Earth? The conversation at Grand Council is how do we do a better job of getting more information so our predictions are actually more accurate? My point of concern is that for the rule curves in the Rainy Namakan system, right, we actually went 0 for 2 in the last 2 years in terms of predicting either that drought or flood. And we're supposed to be the experts, right? Those models, those engineers, right, we're supposed to be the experts. However, we're just human and we need as much information as possible. So that's where we get into the fact of, okay, let's start looking at this as treaty partners. It's a problem for everyone, and we need to start bringing in a more holistic look at what we talk about water regulation, because it's not just going to be widening dams and choke points that's going to get us out of this. It's managing our relationship to that water and bringing in more knowledge and harmonizing those governance systems to really do a better job.
Do I have any extra time there?
Only about 8 seconds, Mr. Pawlowski, so I think we'll call it there and go to Madame Gill pour 6 minutes.
Merci, Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for witnesses for being there. I have questions for the Chief Thomas Diabo from Akwesasne. I must tell you that as a Quebec MP, I did meet a couple of times the members of the Akwesasne community concerning the Treaty OJ. In a study like this one, we talk about emergencies, we talk about crises, and this whole matter of the Canadian-American border and all the problems it creates for the Akwesasne community. I would like to know, when there is a crisis, whatever the crisis, what are the supplementary or additional difficulties given your unique situation? What can we do so that you can better respond to the community needs, be it on one side or the other of the border? If there is a crisis, it's across. So this question is for Mr. Thomas and Mrs. Diabo. Thank you. Monsieur King, tout d'abord. In fact, my question was for Mr. Diabo and Mr. Thomas. Okay, I'm sorry.
During the pandemic, for example, it was difficult for our physicians to come to our home for the elderly because of the ArriveCan, and they were coming from Canada, going work into Canada, but they would have to go through United States. So that was difficult for them to go back through. They would have to, even though it was just for 8 to 10 hours a day, they wouldn't be able to. So that hindered our healthcare sector. We had very little doctors, very little nurses, as well as the American Red Cross. It was difficult for the American Red Cross to come and assist us because of that border, that international border where they would have to, they weren't members of Akwesasne, so there was no right to entrance. They would have to, go through the whole process of the arrive-can. And all of our nurses and the PSWs and the community health nurses were getting fatigued, so we needed some support to come in, and the American Red Cross was not able to come in during this COVID. And in our district, it could be something as minor as my washer and dryer repair. Nobody would come over from Ontario to service our appliances in Quebec. We would have to load up our appliances and take them over. So a lot of our goods, we couldn't get, lumber. We couldn't get any deliveries. We couldn't. That's one thing that's difficult in the Quebec districts, because you have to go through New York State, as well as New York State couldn't come over to Quebec because of the border. There's no technical manned border, but they would still have to report to the U.S. Customs by Messina.
The geography of the whole thing, because our district, Gisnaine, and the district of Ganadago have water on the northern portion and then land on the southern portion. So the only way to get there is through the state. So with all the border restrictions during COVID, prior to COVID, there wasn't a problem because we didn't have the border restrictions. And so we really were exposed to a lot of that. And thankfully, we have a great community where everybody steps up and volunteers. So when you talk about supplementary things that we did to navigate COVID or anything that comes up, our people really step up. And we're really right now suffering from COVID fatigue because we couldn't get that outside support. And a lot of people just don't understand how Akwesasne is built. So until you come down, tour Akwesasne, see the borders, see all the difficulties that we face, and then waiting for answers, and people are trying to figure out how to do it. Where we've been accustomed to over the years, okay, we'll pick you up by boat on Cornwall Island, bring you by the boat to Snai, let you do your thing, and then have to take them back because American customs and people in Washington and sometimes people here in Ottawa don't understand what we're faced with until you come see what's happening in Akwesasne. So a lot of times we're forced to do things ourselves.
I don't have much time, Mr. Thomas, but I would have a last question that could summarize it all. According to you and according to Mrs. Diabo, because there is an agreement between Canada and the United States in relation to the border, like you're asking with a G treaty, could that be a solution? Would that improve the safety of your people? Thank you.
I think what we would need is currently we have an agreement with the CBSA office in Cornwall. We have a remission order that allows that freedom. We don't have that same freedom at the Dundee port, which is on our easternmost part of the reservation, and that leads us directly into Montreal. So really what the J Treaty does is that talks about our individual rights, not our community rights. So a remission order in Dundee and to match the one in Cornwall would probably be a first step. I don't think it would solve it. I think there's other things that need to be worked out between all three governments, our government and the United States and Canadian government, to recognize even with funding, we get funding and it's tagged only to Ontario. It's not tagged to Akwesasne, it's tagged to Ontario. Well, we have 3 jurisdictions and everybody's the same. I have a family who live on the American side. They're not any different than me, and they all live in Akwesasne, but we have funding that is only in place for certain people. So I call it discriminatory funding because it can't service everyone, even though we're all one.
Thank you. Merci. We'll go to Ms. Idlout now for 6 minutes.
First, thank you very much for the witnesses who just gave us presentations. I'm very proud of you, especially from Canada leadership. You had shown tremendous support, and the fact that it's very important to support each other, how we can carry this out. I understand that in your community operations, if you can tell us, I'd like to ask Chief Diablo, from what I heard, that the school bus take about over an hour and a half to go to school. Can you clarify that a bit more or tell us a little bit more about that, how long it takes to cross the borders and how much impact on the families, especially with the kids that are going to school to achieve their education?
Takes them probably one way. Anyway, it depends on how long the wait at U.S. Customs is. Coming from Cornwall Island, Ontario, they have to cross into U.S. Customs, and oftentimes that wait can be anywhere from 40 minutes to close to an hour in line to go to school. And oftentimes the parents would just bring the kids back to where their district or close district, but because of the parents want their children to learn the language because our language is dying, so they send them to the school in the village of St. Regis where it's immersion. It's 100% Mohawk language, so that's what they do. And sometimes they would drive them in themselves, so they would pick them up at school and drive them home in their own vehicle.
At this time, this committee here are meeting about the understanding of the preparedness measures. So the children that goes to school, are there any preparedness, emergency preparedness for these children?
Yes, they do drills, as well as they'll have things on the bus should anything happen. If they get in a car accident and things like that, they have communication. They're communicated with the central dispatch, as well as the school itself. So there is, they do evacuation drills. They do bus drills, because we did have a long time ago a bus accident. So that's one of the priorities that they do have, and fire drills. And so we are really well prepared, active shooter, things like that. So we do all those kind of drills with the school.
How can you make changes to, if you were to change the Cornwall example, but in order to protect the school children, how would you make changes? What kind of changes would you like to see to the federal government in order to get more support about the school children?
What I would like to see is for the Canadian Customs to be moved from Cornwall, because even if you're on Cornwall Island, or if I'm coming from my district, I still have to, and I have to go to the doctors on Cornwall Island. I still have to go to Cornwall, turn a report, come back through, and go to the school. So I would just like that the Port Authority to be moved, either to be moved by the U.S. Customs, or, have something in place like that. Because in order for me to go from one district to the other, I still have to go from Quebec to Ontario, I still have to go report, even though I'm still in Akwesasne. So that's the same thing with the children. You still have to go to Cornwall and come back and go to the island. You know, so that would either be put on next to U.S. Customs as one solution.
I think another thing we have to look at, prior to becoming chief, I spent 16 years as our transportation supervisor for our school board. So our geography, again, is a big issue because from Cornwall Island, there's only one way on and off. We have an international bridge going south and the low-level bridge going north. But if either one of those bridges get taken out, we're stuck. And same for the district of Ganadago. There's one road in and out, and that's it. And same with Gisnida. There's two roads in and out, and that's it. We don't get enough funding to help maintain those roads, number one, but we need to have alternative routes outside of the ones we have now so we can be better prepared in case, you know, the custom is a hindrance, absolutely, but the fact that we only have one way in and out to our districts is, I think, a bigger hindrance.
Thank you very much. We have an opportunity for a shortened second round. If members wish to avail themselves, it'll be 3 minutes for Conservatives and Liberals and 1.5 minutes for the Bloc and the NDP. I'm going to turn to Mr. Shields for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Appreciate the witness today. I think the coordination you do and what you're talking about, I could ask the political question of the two countries, the two provinces, the two counties. Which is the easiest one to deal with? But you're not going to answer that, I know. You've developed a partnership and you know how to make it work, which is incredible. But I think there's something you brought up in your testimony. I'm going to go to Mr. King because I think it relates to you as well. And Mr. King, when we're talking about water, in my writing, I had two examples in a previous one where working with Indigenous moving, because we had to adapt in the sense of how do we deal with the flooding situations that are occurring in my writing with the two major rivers. But in yours, what I want to get to is you're talking about, and you didn't talk about it much, but you did. What is the mental challenges of constantly moving people from their territory to a isolated setting in an urban area? What does that create and how can we resolve this? What's your recommendation?
It's huge. The mental, emotional, spiritual impacts, to evacuation from your home is absolutely massive. I mean, one of the biggest issues on that actually too is because of, and you mentioned like the different jurisdictions, right, that Akwesasne is dealing with, and in Treaty 3 where Manitoba, Ontario, and then water flows in from Minnesota as well too, and there's relations in Minnesota and Manitoba, and actually choice of many of our communities is to head west towards a larger Anishinaabe nation and to Winnipeg and to Manitoba, and that's kind of more home base, right? And what happens right now is that those impacts from a emotional, spiritual, and mental standpoint are actually increased because we can only do evacuation funding in Ontario and have to move folks actually further away instead of a close drive to, say, Winnipeg, which actually many have relationships there, many have family members there. So the evacuation piece speaks to our preparedness and better regulating water and being better prepared, right? So we don't need to evacuate. But then in the instance of evacuation, we actually need to have protocols in place, right, that allow for that to happen to somewhere where that space is as comfortable as possible for those that are being evacuated, and everything is being done for them to return home as soon as possible as well.
You're saying in adapting, we need to do something different than evacuation.
Yes, we need to be more prepared for evacuation. Build up, have better access in terms of roadways, right? If you only have one access spot to a community and that gets flooded out, your access to food, medical is all taken. So we need to have better access roadways, better communication in flooding events, right? Better resources prepared prior to flooding events, and that comes to then those strategies of water regulation, early notices, making sure that there's food, water, accessibility to everything into a community so we don't have to evacuate. And then in the instance of an evacuation, making sure that's as safe a space as possible and most comfortable space as possible in that instance.
Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll now go to Mr. McLeod if he wants to use 3 minutes. It's over to you, Mr. McLeod.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to everyone that's presented today. Very interesting presentations and really points to the some of the challenges in the Indigenous communities when it comes to emergencies. My question is for Treaty 3. I listened with real interest because I come from Northwest Territories, and we don't have, we have 2 reserves, but most of our communities are Indigenous communities that have a number of different local governments. We have the Indian bands, we have the Métis councils, some communities have the Inuit councils, then we have the municipal government, and then the government Northwest Territories, and then when it comes to emergencies, the federal government has a role to play. So it takes a lot of cooperation, and in some cases there's alliances, and there's other cases where cooperation agreements are actually signed so that everybody knows their role. Because if there's a mix-up, lives could be lost, and if you're not sure who's handling what, it becomes very concerning when it comes to infrastructure and other properties, including loss of life. So I'm aware that in some provinces, like in BC, they've moved to a trilateral agreement to ensure coordination between First Nations and both the federal and provincial levels of government. So I'd like to ask if the representative here for Treaty 3 thinks that having a trilateral agreement, an arrangement in Ontario would also be beneficial.
Yeah, I think that would be hugely beneficial. I think the other side of that, it may not even be trilateral. We could even talk quadrilateral, right? Because of the portion of Treaty 3 that is in Manitoba as well. So making sure that all of those jurisdictions are at the table when we talk about emergency management and the resources and planning that needs to go into it. So an agreement between the Anishinaabe Nation and Treaty 3, Manitoba, Ontario, and the feds would be definitely a milestone in terms of working together that way.
My next question is for the Mohawk of Akwesasne. I really had to try to sort it out in my head to follow the number of different jurisdictions in your community, with a community that's split by 2 countries and then 2 counties and 2 provinces. I'm wondering, when it comes to an actual emergency, who declares the state of emergency? Is that the chief that does that?
If we could have a quick response, please, because we're running out of time.
Depends on where the emergency is. It could be either the Emergency Management Office at the tribe or the Emergency Measures Office at Mohawk Council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Madame Gill, vous avez 90 secondes.
Mrs. Gill, 1.5 minutes. Thank you. So quickly. For the chiefs, I would like to say that we are aware to what extent this is very complicated, the Akwesasne issue, and as a committee, hopefully we'll be able to go to better understand what's happening in Akwesasne. And I would like to say, could you conclude with what is the most important thing for you when we're talking about emergency measures and preparedness? Any other ideas? Anything that you would want a report to highlight and something that we can do in terms of recommendations? Thank you. My wish list would be to have
like a continuing funding so we can provide more of our equipment, training of our people to be better responders, as well as a large unified public safety building as well as a one central dispatch unit. So just funding to fund all those, the public safety building and training and equipment, PPE.
Alors, c'est tout, Madame Gill.
Is that all, Mrs. Gill? Okay. Madame Odlaut.
King, first of all, congratulations on the anniversary of the signing of Treaty 3. I'm interested in the PowerPoint that you sent us called Reconciling Sovereignties in Treaty Number 3. And I wondered if you could quickly explain, just as an example, how examples regarding child protection could be used as a better way to explain the slide that you've sent us.
Totally, and I will do my best to do it as quick as possible as well. So what you see in the slides, right, are two parallels of governance, right? One being the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3, and then the other being Western governance systems. In that instance, right, harmonized through the signing of Treaty 3. And what most often happens is that, say, when we talk about child protection or emergency management, right, working in, we'll say in quotes, partnership with Crown entities, it is we will fund this work to do it this way. And this is the way that we expect it to be done. These are the protocols that we have it done. And it needs to be worked within that Western track, right? And that's the issue, right? So for childcare, for example, that really speaks to, okay, it's the federal and provincial governments that are dictating how Anishinaabe children are being cared for. And really what we need to be looking at, right, is how do we harmonize those governance approaches so that it's actually the Anishinaabe Nation in Treaty 3 protocols and processes that are guiding childcare. And that they're being cared for in a way that is culturally appropriate, safe, and not, back into the policies around integration into a Western parallel, right? And that, at the end of the day, is when we talk about participation and inclusion of traditional knowledge and nations, right? We need to really look at harmonization and operating in that treaty space, opposed to, just participating or trying to move one governance structure into another governance structure.
Thank you very much. This brings our second panel to a close. Thank you, Mr. King, for appearing before us today, and thank you to Chiefs Diabo and also Chief Thomas for coming here from Akwesasne to answer our questions, our wide-ranging questions. We very much appreciate it. With that, I will sort of end panel number 2. I see Mr. Badaway has his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, before you do adjourn the meeting, I have 2 questions, if I may. One is with respect to the study that we're discussing today, when are we expected to bring or discuss drafting instructions?
So on that question, given the fact that last week we agreed amongst ourselves with a couple of amendments to focus priority on C-29, that will take us till the 28th of October, our last session. And then, of course, we have to follow that up with doing clause by clause in an expeditious manner. So we're into early November. And I will just add that there are 2 other things that I mentioned that we need to revisit. One is revisit the updated NIHB report, which the analysts are going to update given the amendments that we proposed and new resolutions and new recommendations. And then also at some point, we were going to this Thursday, for example, look at future studies. So The drafting instructions for this study are important as well, and so I think in the coming days and weeks we should decide what should come right after C29. Should it be, how quickly do we want to do one of the three? Which of the three in which order should we do? Should it be the drafting instructions? Should it be the NIHB report, or should it be deciding on future studies? In what order? Mr. Schmale, go ahead.
To that, Chair, given the fact that we, I think on this side, may, I don't know, potentially have one more week left in our time here, could we use time later this week to talk about drafting instructions? Because I don't want to leave this to the new group who had no idea what has been said in the past to kind of navigate. Pardon me? I don't know. We don't know. If you could message Pierre, that would be awesome. Maybe later question period, you could throw a note that way.
So
I will miss you too, Vince.
So,
so if we could get this out of the way, I mean that in a nice way. Before we leave, that would be great.
So a suggestion here, we did say we wanted to start off with C29 this Thursday, and that would probably be with the ministers coming. It's up to the committee to decide whether we might want to reserve 20 minutes at the end of it for us to look at drafting instructions, so that the old gang from the Conservative Party, the former gang, can have an opportunity to speak up. Is that something that would be acceptable?
Did you say, sorry, Aaron, I were coming on. Did you say with the ministers take 20 minutes?
The ministers are going to be asked to be here Thursday to in connection with C29. Yeah, that's a normal thing to invite the sponsoring minister. That I don't know at this point. Yeah, the committee hasn't made a decision on that. Normally they come for an hour, but yeah. But so that would leave us some time. Okay. Do we have agreement on that, or is this another connected point?
Well, that's I would put that forward, that we do set some time aside on Thursday afternoon.
Out of the 2 hours?
Out of the 2 hours.
Okay.
Maybe 20 minutes we can discuss some drafting instructions for...
Sorry, we're talking about internal stuff here.
Sorry guys.
You're welcome to curve in.
I guess the second question, Mr. Chair, that I would have is with respect to C29, I'm assuming that the witnesses are to be submitted by October 5th, this Wednesday?
That's what we agreed to.
Great, thank you. And lastly, I guess to you, Mr. Chairman, to the clerk, if we can have the amended and adopted C29 forwarded to the members, that would be wonderful, so we can be...
He's also saying, confirming that the proposed changes to C29 that may be coming up, that we will get those to the members.
Not the motion, not the motions. So, okay.
Yeah, so as you know, any proposed changes will go through the legislative clerks and just to see if it's in what shape and if it's allowable, and then it goes to the clerk, who then distributes it. Yeah. I don't think we're going to get it before Thursday. I think that's maybe, remember, it has to be bilingual, and we have to have, the inputs will only come on well, the inputs will come over the course of the next few weeks. If you're talking about potential changes to C29, we didn't decide when that had to come.
I circulated an email.
I read the email from the clerk. There's an amendment, or an email from the clerk. In fact, has a very good little 3-minute video that I encourage everybody to go through, because it spells out how a committee deals with legislation at committee stage. It gives very good advice on the process by which we get to the point where we go through clause by clause, with the proposed changes. I'm sure you're very familiar with that.
But I want to be clear, Mr. Chairman, if I may, that simply all I'm looking for is the amended version of Bill C-29. That's all I'm looking for.
That may not come. There is no specific at the moment.
The only thing that I circulated is the order of reference that came from journals, right. And that's what that's all that I have.
It doesn't spell out. I encourage people who know what changes they may wish to make to C-29 to go through that process that's described in the email as quickly as possible so that it can be looked at, found out if it's allowable, and in which form it will be, and then translated and then distributed. That's the process. Okay?
Thank you.
Very good. Happy, Mr. Badaway? Very good. Everything has to happen yesterday. I know. All right, with that, thank you very much, everybody on the panel, and I call this...
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, sir.
I just want to extend an invitation to anybody who would like to come visit our reservation. Chief Taibo and I are willing hosts and tour guides.
Invitation. Thank you very much, Chief Thomas and Chief Diabo.
Right.
So, sounds like a full day because we got to go to a lot of countries and a lot of places. Thank you. This is adjourned.